How significant is Karzai's rejection of the U.S. apologizing for recently killing 9 Afghan children? Karzai is a real headache for our national security establishment and for NATO. NATO put him in. They liked his look. He's from a Pashtun background. And ever since, it's become perfectly clear that the country he runs has an economy that is based on drugs, poppy, heroin sold to European markets where 10,000 people a year die of drug overdoses. And he continually keeps making remarks against the United States, apparently to stay in office, even though he should be able to stay in office since he's trying to fix elections. As I said in the counterinsurgency program, the big problem for counterinsurgency is that you need an ally. We're not trying to impose imperial rule and stay. We're trying to beat back the insurgency and install a client who's friendly to our interests, as defined by whom I'll leave to you. Karzai won't work, and counterinsurgency will not work without a Kabul government that is popular and legitimate and capable of standing on its own without having to rig elections. That's part of the reason that the NATO support is drawing down. Instead, we keep talking about building up the Afghan army as a prelude to our leaving. Who knows how that venture will go and what it costs? There's no evidence that it's done much, but you can't really build up the Afghan army with Karzai as the president. One reason Obama has said 2014 is the deadline for some kind of withdrawal, is that 2014 is also the next election in Afghanistan, and Karzai cannot replace himself. So watch the ball. Somebody is going to find a candidate, there'll be probably several, competing to be elected president of Afghanistan on a platform of saying goodbye to the American forces. That's why they're putting the deadline back, not because they need to kill more Taliban, but because they're waiting for the 2014 Afghan election. Today's New York Times makes victory in Afghanistan seem so far away. I think we need to stop the Taliban, but what are our alternatives to war? I don't think the Taliban are going to take over. I think they took over in the power vacuum, which led to a civil war, which led to American intervention. But the Taliban cannot be eliminated because they're as natural to the Pashtun areas and as natural to Afghan nationalism as the poppies. They're deeply planted. They're not like the Americans or the Germans or, the people who are going to go back to the West. So probably the debate in the near future will be a nasty one over whether Afghanistan should be partitioned or there should be some sort of power sharing with a confederation of government at the top with international status for the city of Kabul and with peacekeepers brought in not from the NATO countries but from non-aligned armies from other countries in the region. I think that's probably how the hemorrhaging is going to stop. The two choices, one is to stop the hemorrhaging and the other is to let it just become more of an incredible humanitarian catastrophe, far beyond what anybody reading the New York Times can comprehend. Is giving money to rebel leaders in Afghanistan to quell dissent more of a problem than a solution? Should we avoid using monetary tactics of negotiation? If you take money away from the CIA, they won't have anything to negotiate. They carry around big suitcases of cash and call it lobbying in the green zone in Iraq and in Afghanistan. This question is about Americans using American money to pay off the Taliban or local insurgents to let vehicles and convoys go through on roads to support the troops that were supporting against those same insurgents. Nothing could be more twisted than this case study, and there's plenty of congressional hearing on it and newspaper articles. But what's happening is very close to a mafia state or a warlord state that doesn't have hegemony or centralized power in any one hands. And so you can understand why our mafia pays off their mafia to make the convoy pass through, because that's how you get money in your pocket. Crazy? Well, read Catch-22. The shock doctrine is in full swing in Wisconsin, using the recession and the deficit furor to wage a war on labor. Wisconsin Senate passed legislation 18-1 without a quorum of 20. Well, as long as those Democratic leaders in Wisconsin stay away, and we should not use the terminology that they're in hiding, they are in boycott, they are in opposition, the situation will be stuck. My hope is that the war on collective bargaining is abandoned when the public opinion polls show such damage to the Republican governor that he's forced to give up. It may take these subsequent elections and recalls to become threatening enough to do that. But right now, I think this is a colossal conflict between the social movement and Machiavellians who want to repeal the past and present gains of social movements. Hillary Clinton recently said something similar to the administration won't listen to polls about Afghanistan. I missed that. They're ignoring the base. Yes, that's right. If a majority already wants the troops brought home, what will they respond to? Well, I think it is true that when the polling doesn't look good to a Secretary of State, then the polling is seen as sort of a nuisance. Like elections are a nuisance when you have to carry out an unpopular war. But, eventually, I think they have to listen to a number of things. 1, reason. 2, evidence. 3, polling data. And 4, the projection of possible defection of votes in 2012, or the loss of volunteers, or the loss of contributions. Those are the things that they will respond to. I presume that Hillary Clinton's statement that you quote there, if it's true, is simply a kind of a public relations. What is she supposed to say? We will listen to polls about Afghanistan? Can't say that. So it becomes a statement by the elite that they're not going to be influenced by polls. But we know in the dead of night they're just poring over these polls looking for weak spots. Who do I feel provides the best media coverage of the wars? What sources do you recommend we follow? I read books. Too many books to start. A very good book by Robert Dreyfuss will explain to you the madness, the Machiavellian madness that lies behind this struggle. It's called Devil's Game: How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam. Another version of the same theory by Robert Baer, Sleeping with the Devil: How Washington Sold Our Soul for Saudi Crude. I think that also you can search online. You can go to a number of websites. I think BBC is better than anything else in the American media. I think Al Jazeera really has valuable perspectives. I'm old-fashioned, so over coffee I read the New York Times every morning. and refuse to read it online because I like the feel of it in my hands. But I read it as kind of a guide to where the establishment is at. I try to read between the lines and detect where things may be going. I don't ever expect the New York Times to have the fortitude to write an editorial calling for the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, there's no paper, mainstream paper in America that has done that, which is remarkable when you think that 86% of Democrats and a majority of Americans want us out of there as quickly as possible. We sold Libya huge sums of weapons. Now we're arming their resistance. How often have we done this? I think we relied on Italy to do it in the past, but it's generally been the course of the British Empire, and we, the Americans, the baby brothers of the British Empire, have done it. I don't know what more to say unless there's other questions about Libya, but you can sense that Obama is now caught in the same trap with the media pounding and civilian casualties mounting. He's going to be accused of doing nothing, as if Bill Clinton could have done something in Rwanda. Nobody ever says quite what, at what price, and for how long. So this is the way that wars can begin. It's unaffordable, it's unimaginable to me, but it's happened, and it is more consistently the pattern that not. Read the history of some of these interventions, including the book Overthrow, which is a brilliant book on interventions in the last 100 years. Any thoughts on dismantling the military-industrial complex? It's a big problem. I think that the military-industrial complex has got to be transformed and subjected to a planned transition to a smaller military budget and a greater use of those scientists, engineers, and industrial plants to carry out the green economic revolution and green jobs. Putting it in terms of a transition is probably a better way to put it, and I'm sincere in this, than to say let's dismantle the military-industrial complex and think that you're going to get a lot of public support. Can you give some examples of direct and indirect costs of the wars? How does the U.S. differentiate between the two? If you go to our website at tomhayden.com, the Peace Bulletin, you can find some writings on this. But the simple answer is it shouldn't be in the hands of so many people in the Pentagon who have a vested interest. What happens is you have a so-called direct budget for Afghanistan and Iraq, which is $164 billion for the fiscal year. Direct means, I think I can simplify this, direct appropriation of revenues for soldiers and their equipment on the battlefield. It's $1 million a soldier and rising, by the way. But that budget, which has to be supported one way or another annually by Congress, does not include the indirect costs. There are many of those. The most obvious are the long-term health care costs for the casualties and the wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan, which are never included in the overall cost. Stiglitz and Bilmes, Dr. Stiglitz at Columbia and Bilmes at Harvard, Linda Bilmes, have calculated that if you include the indirect costs that they define as indirect, it comes to a $3 trillion cost for Iraq alone.